My name is Peter Maguire. In 1997, I created and launched jazz clubs worldwide. The past year or so has been something of an existential crisis for the jazz scene worldwide. Upside or downside, it has, however, provided space and time for reflection. Jazz, My Life, is a non-sequential series of my own personal recollection and thoughts about my own lifelong immersion in the world of jazz. If you feel inclined to do so, please click on the subscribe button and the notification Saxman icon. What did you do in the trad wars, Daddy? It might seem remarkable at this point in the 21st century to realise that in the mid-20th century, certainly in the United Kingdom, I'm not quite so sure about other parts of the world, but certainly in the United Kingdom, there was actually an actual jazz war. This was between the people who followed the New Orleans jazz style and what they regarded to be the unmentionable beboppers. New Orleans jazz had a great attraction for many people on many levels. Most held the view that New Orleans jazz musicians, in fact, in general, were perhaps unschooled, unsophisticated musicians who in fact played from the heart, and this really counted above actually technical proficiency. This really was in fact something of a delusion. Many of the musicians in New Orleans in fact were extremely good musicians, sophisticated musicians, and many of them, particularly from the Creole section of the community, came from extremely cultured and sophisticated families. However, it suited the kind of outlook of the people who followed New Orleans to believe that, well, it was something they either didn't know or they actually ignored these facts. You must realise that, in fact, information about jazz at this time was not quite so easy to get hold of. I mean, now we have so many books about jazz, but it was limited at that time. And certainly any kind of real academic studies of jazz was something that was rather far off. All you had to do, though, was to listen to the music, say, of Jelly Roll Morton, the Red Hot Peppers, to realise this was sophisticated music played by extremely skilled musicians. However, the New Orleans people, I think in general, preferred the people like Bunk Johnson, who hadn't played for years. He was rediscovered, not as the legend has it in the rice fields, but I'm doing a kind of mundane job somewhere. Anyway, he was supplied with a new set of false teeth and a trumpet, and in fact had a late flowering career as a New Orleans musician, and in fact great international acclaim. Great international acclaim. You can see his music and listen to his music on YouTube if you wish to. However, this section of the jazz public in England was extremely passionate about their music, very, very, very passionate, and there was a whole host of mythology that was built around it, and not all untrue, but there was a good deal of mythology built around this in terms of putting their aspirations onto musicians and their motivations. George Lewis was another favourite of the jazz aficionados, and even today you will hear clarinet players who are influenced by George Lewis with one of his famous little phrases, da 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 da, which is a characteristic little run which you can hear many people. A bit like the situation where most of the French musicians who played soprano sax tended to have that very exaggerated Sidney Bechet sound. However, in the early 40s, Bebop began to raise its head, certainly at the end of the Second World War. This new school of musicians, who were totally divorced from the outlook of the New Orleans musicians, in fact found their way to New York, working on the boats and playing. In general, were extremely good musicians and had a very deep interest in technique, etc., etc. Where conversely, the New Orleans aficionados, while using an anachronism, you could almost regard their kind of mindset as being a form of punk. People of very little musical ability, but great energy and enthusiasm. However, there was deep resentment between the modernists, as they were called, and the New Orleans. They were very identifiable. The modernists would be very smartly dressed, sharp Italian suits, ties, certain very identifiable hairstyles. In general, the New Orleans people tended to be on the bohemian side with unkept clothes, beards, hair, long, etc., etc., etc. A couple of people I knew on the modernist scene at this time, they would actually deliberately go to New Orleans gigs and sit or stand in front of the bandstand to try and psych the band out. A particular instance is illuminating. Humphrey Littleton, the trumpet player, broadcaster and many other things, came originally to music via the New Orleans genre, but he gradually began to move towards a more mainstream style, and in fact was doing a concert in Birmingham, a famous concert, where he had included in the lineup the rather good saxophone player Bruce Turner, alto saxophone player. From the audience, a pained shout came up from the crowd. "Go home, dirty bopper." It was a controversy that filled the musical press at the time, and Humph's position as being a leading upholder of the New Orleans tradition was finished forever. It's strange, but in some ways we're thinking all about feeling, and technique was really way down the list, way down the list. And people could have played a great deal better. It was all a misconception, or most of it was a misconception. Their heroes, in fact, were much better musicians than they realised. Some people did actually move on. I mean, for instance, Keith Christie, the trombone player, Dickie Horden, the trumpet player, became leading lights on the modernist scene in London. It's curious to note that, in fact, these attitudes, in fact, amongst some, let's say, more mature members of the population, continue to hold these kind of opinions. I recently had an email exchange with somebody who I vaguely knew many years ago, and he was going on at length to me about how there was no real jazz after probably 1937, and in fact modern players were all to do with technique and no soul and no emotion, etc., etc., which of course is complete nonsense. I mean, all you have to do is say listen to a Coltrane Ballads album to know this is complete nonsense. But there are many people, in fact, who still believe this without really ever thinking, well, shall I examine the reality of it? Because, of course, it would pop the myth, and they don't feel any need to do this. And I do hear, in fact, from some of the New Orleans musicians I know, that there are still elderly gents and the occasional elderly lady who do sit there very stoically in front of the performing band, who, being New Orleans, normally the front line sits on chairs along the front of the bandstand, just to make sure that they don't corrupt the spirit of this particular genre. Having said all this, one must acknowledge that whether they were the New Orleans aficionados or the modernists or bebop players, they were, at least both the musicians and the public, and particularly the public, passionate about the music. And in the final analysis, one really must accept that this was an admirable trait.